So in the last video, we finished up our SDA fabric. Everything is intact now, and really the next steps are to validate that devices can get online, get IP addresses, and function. So here, what we'll be looking at is configuring ICE and DHCP initially for all of the networks that we created. I'll be using Windows DHCP. We saw that we set that as the DHCP server that is assigned to the switches when we set up the Anycast gateways. What we'll notice here is if we log into our border, we'll see when we look at those interfaces that they do indeed have an IP helper that points at the Windows domain controller. And of course, that came from those network settings that we assigned in the DHCP server that we assigned to the reservations for those scopes. So in here, those are actually going to live on the edge switches. Again, fully routed. There we can see it. And this is a good, note as well, right? This is Edge Switch 02. We have this Anycast gateway configured here. Notice the MAC address, the Lisp information. If I now jump over to my other Edge switch, we will see that 10.204.2.1 exists there as well. So this is part of, obviously, the fabric with DNA, where this is a layer 2 routed network, but of course Lisp and VXLAN, everything handles this in the background. So while it might seem weird that I have the same IP address assigned to two different switches in the same VLAN, that's kind of the smoke and mirrors magic of SDA. So what we will do first is we will look, right, we've got VLAN 2, 3, 10, and 254. If you recall, when we look here, 2 is voice, 3 is a corporate wireless SID, 10 is data, and 254 is our access points. So we need to obviously have DHCP available for these, and we also need to have an ICE policy that will tell clients that are trying to authenticate to go into this VLAN appropriately. So first thing we'll do is we'll go create these DHCP scopes. So on my Windows domain controller, I also have DHCP installed. So in here, we're going to want to do new scope. $10, $199, 0. Let's make sure we see this in the background so I don't fat finger this. And we'll just say, oops, that's obviously not 0. Data is going to be 10.1.10 through 10.199 1.250. That's a WAC 24. Nothing to do for this. We'll leave that default. We want to configure advanced options. Our gateway 10.199. Shoot, I did this wrong, didn't I? 204 1.1. There we go. That's our gateway. Automatically populated ourselves as the DNS server, so that's fine. And we want to activate it. Then we're going to go through and do the same thing for the other scopes. Still on the 199 train. Got that guy done. It's still doing the 10.199. Don't know what my deal is here. And then the last one that we're going to have some additional configuration to is the wireless access points. So here, the first portion of this will be the same. 10, 204, 254, 10. Our default gateway. Same DNS servers. And once we activate this scope, there's yet another step that we'll want to do. We want to use plug-and-play provisioning for the wireless access points so that they learn where they need to go when they come on the network. Again, if you've worked with wireless in the past outside of DNAC, you can point this at a wireless controller directly, and the APs will reach out to the controller. They'll join the controller, and you can move on from there. With DNAC involved, whether it be SDA or just over-the-top wireless, we can point these access points at DNAC, and they will show up in the plug-and-play portal. From there, we can provision them right through, and it will hand them off to the controller. They'll download code, reboot, whatever they need to do to start to function on the network. So from that perspective, there are a couple of different ways, right? The same ways we've always had, DNS or DHCP. In this case, I'm just going to use DHCP, but with DNS, it's the PNP server dot your domain name that it will resolve in its join process. With the DHCP option, it's option 43 with a specific string. The string is a little weird. We'll paste it in here. So in my AP scope, under my options, I'm going to configure options, advanced. I'm going to go down and find 43. And in here, If it'll let me, it won't let me, I don't think, paste in any data here. So I'll have to type it. So 5A1N semicolon. So 5A1N specifies the DHCP sub option for plug and play. Then we have B2, which tells us that we are returning an IP address instead of a host name. If you were returning a host name, it would be B1, another semicolon, then followed by K4. This says we're going to use HTTP as opposed to HTTPS, another colon, I, in my case, the IP address of DNAC, semicolon, J80, which of course is going to be our port. So that will be returned to the access point when it comes online, and it will tell it reach out to DNAC, which of course will invoke the plug and play. So we'll assign that. That should be everything we need for DHCP here. The next thing we'll need to do is jump over to ICE and get it configured so that we can bring that access point onto the network. So in ICE, obviously our access point is not going to do .1x, at least not by default. We could configure it that way later, but it will need to come in via wired MAB, authenticate, get returned to be in the proper VLAN, so that the port goes into the right VLAN and it gets an IP address in that VLAN. So here under policy sets, we have our own, just the default policy, which I'm just going to use again in a production environment. Obviously, you would have more than this. The default policy set, default network access. In our authentication, we are handling wired MAB, wireless MAB, wired.1x, wireless.1x, and at this point, we will be able to configure the policy. So that should take care of it for all of our DHCP scopes. Everything should be created. And at this point, we need to obviously move over to ICE to be able to configure ICE to return the proper attributes for our endpoint devices so that when they authenticate, they get put in the right VLAN and all of that kind of fun stuff. So in this case, when I jump over to ICE, I'm already kind of in here, but policy sets. We have our default policy set, which of course comes with ICE. We're going to insert a new one above. I'm going to call this wired MAB. And again, this is definitely not via best practice, but it is going to key in on anything wired MAB. We'll save that. And this is going to be for our access point, probably for our phone too. It's not going to do any .1x by default in here, so it's going to come in wired MAB. We are going to insert a new row above MAB, and again MAB, like I said, definitely not best practice, but nonetheless, I'm going to go internal endpoints. If user not found, continue, because of course these users aren't going to exist. Whoops, didn't mean to click that. Save that. And then on our authorization policy, we are going to insert a new rule. Wireless APs. And in here, for our result, we're going to create a new authorization profile. I'm going to call it access points. And in here, we're going to return an access accept, but we are also going to change the VLAN to, what was it? 254. So in here, 254, that's what we get there. And then of course we need to key in on those. So we're going to use profiling to learn and understand what those APs are. So in here, because I'm lazy, I'm just going to key in on specific access point models, endpoint policy, anything that's at or under the Cisco access point realm. We'll use that. In here, we're returning access points. The other thing I need to do, because we're in closed mode, is I need to make a profiling policy that at least returns an access accept to anybody trying to authenticate with MAB, so that the switch sends the accounting data to ICE so that it can actually profile the device. So here, I'm just going to call this profile. It is going to be any wired MAB device. And again, maybe not best practice, but nonetheless. And in here, for the result, I'm going to call this profile. And then I'm going to have to go edit that. So here, just so that I can save it, I am going to go to my results, and I'm going to go to downloadable ACLs. I am going to add one, call it the profile ACL, and we're going to say, and I'm not even going to leave the comments in here, but we're going to permit DHCP, and then we're going to deny everything else. So really, all this is doing is saying, hey, send back an access accept. That's required because the switch, or excuse me, ICE relies on the accounting data that the switch sends it to profile the device. If we don't send an access accept, the switch never sends, it just ends it, and it never sends that data back, thus we can't profile it. So here, what we're doing is we're saying, hey, you can request DHCP, but we're going to make sure that you can't go anywhere on the network at this point. So now that I've updated and created the ACL, I need to go update that profile policy, and we're going to assign this DACL. And at this point, in the background, that access point has probably been attempting to authenticate, and in the time that we did this, it may have already figured it out. But here, we can see it figured out it's a Cisco AP. Up until this point, it was hitting the default policy. We should see it hit the MAB policy, so just to make it quick, I'm going to go over here and find where that guy is. Yeah, we see our 3850 and then that IP phone on ports 4 and 5. So we're going to reboot them, and I'm going to just pause this for a minute until they come back up. So we can see here that the ports came up. Whoops, I just got kicked out. Oh, come on. And we saw some authentication fails, which we would expect because we're doing MAB, not .1x. And if we come back over to ICE and we refresh this page here, we can see down in the list here that our device came online. It now picked up the proper wired MAB profile, and off to the races it went. So at this point, if we go back over to our switch, log in, we should see this device did indeed get an IP address, and it did get an address in the 254 network, which of course also has it in VLAN 254, we can see here. So now that it's got an address, assuming PNP worked properly, if we go back over to Catalyst Center here, DNAC, and go to Provision Plug and Play, sure enough, we see that this device showed up and it's ready to be claimed. Now, we can't really do anything with it yet. We don't have a wireless controller, so let's get to work on that. The wireless controller will be in our vCenter. So if I pull that over here, the initial config for that guy, that is Lab 1. We want our Lab 2 wireless controller. We will power that on. Again, this has not been configured at all, so we are going to do this from scratch. First via the virtual console here. And I'm going to pause while this boots up. Okay, this guy came up and got logged in. The only config on him right now is the username, password, and host name that was configured in the OVA when I deployed it. So we need to configure the networking and get that all up and running, get it added to DNAC, add it to our fabric, just like we did the rest of the switches. However, in this case, there's no fabric work to be done specifically as it relates to the ISIS and routing. So here, we're just going to go ahead and assign an IP address. These controllers have 3 interfaces by default, being that it's a virtual controller. I'm only going to use one of them. There's a number of different methodologies here that you could use. You know, you could make that port a trunk. You could create an SVI for the management interface, so on and so forth. For this, I'm just going to assign that raw to gig 1 and have it hold the IP address. So here, I'm going to shut down the other 2 just because. 2 and 3 shut. And then interface gigabit Ethernet 1. IP address is going to be 10.199.0.24. Oops. Put in our default route. And at this point, should be able to ping to the internet, so that takes care of that piece. We need to make sure some wireless specific things here. Wireless management interface, gigabit Ethernet 1. Wireless country US will bypass the auto day 0 startup script for the controller. We need our SNMP credentials, so here we will do user DNAC D3 turn on netconf. Should be on by default on these guys, I believe, but we'll hit it there. And the other thing we need to do, because this is a virtual controller, the physical controllers have a manufacturer installed MIC or cert that they'll use, but the virtual controller obviously doesn't. So we have to create that. Wireless config VWLLC. Key size 2048, signature algo SHA 256. And you'll see here this is going to spin up and start creating a cert. Now if we did all of that correct and we go back to this guy here, Add a device. Select our credentials. Test them to make sure I didn't do anything wrong there. And I did, and I realized right away what I did. I forgot to create the group for SNMP, so try that again. Now it looks good, and we'll go ahead and add that guy. And then I'll pause the video here because it will take some time for that to show up. And there we have it. So same song and dance here. We're going to assign it to our site. And the interesting thing that you'll notice here is that this wireless controller, unlike the switches, does not live in the fabric, right? It is out of the fabric. It's, in my network anyway, up by DNA Center, but it certainly doesn't need to be in the fabric to provide fabric-based wireless services. So here we go. We get the same kind of deployment. Now keep in mind, if this wireless controller is outside of the fabric, I mentioned this way earlier in the video series, but you have to be careful, right? It used to be that we had like a 300 millisecond round trip time that we could have between the access points and the controller. When we are working with fabric, that requirement has changed. According to the design guide, that round trip time has to be 20 milliseconds or less between the AP and the wireless controller. So, unless you've got dark fiber between the sites where the wireless controller sits and the fabric, you'll obviously want to be careful about that. Then we will go ahead and provision this. And again, here we already assigned it to the site. However, now we have another configuration option here where we need to tell it what locations it's going to manage. Right now, it's only managing the floor of the site that I assigned it to. In my network here, if I had multiple floors, obviously I would want it to manage the wireless networks for those as well. So if I had, multiple floors, 1, 2, 3, and 4, by default, it's only going to be on floor 1. I'm going to need to make sure that it manages any of the networks in the list here. So we'll save that. Next, next, next. Apply. Next. And now we've got our config. We'll go ahead and deploy that. And we'll wait for this deployment to finish. And now that it's successful, similar situation here where we go back over to our fabric site. And now all of a sudden we notice we've got this wireless controller. When we open it up, we can turn on wireless and deploy that. There's our config, and what's interesting here is it shows that it's also going to push some information over to this border node. And I don't know if that's something else that was pending, but let's take a look. It's updating some Lisp here, okay, for the wireless. That makes sense. So we will submit that. And again, we'll watch this and make sure it finishes successfully. And according to this, it already has. So if we come back over here, we can see now this is running our wireless controller. And at this point now, when we go over to the wireless SIDs, we should see our Corp SID. And here is where we can now choose the wireless pool that we assign to that. We get our config, submit it, and again over to our tasks, and we'll watch that provision, show success. And now if we go back to our plug and play, what we're going to see is our AP is still here, unclaimed, waiting. If we click on the AP, we claim it. It's going to give us an opportunity to rename it. We are going to call this the pitcher's mound. What site is it going to? And notice an AP has to be assigned to a floor. You can't assign it to a site or a building, excuse me. And we'll say next here. Wants us to assign an RF profile. These we can build, but we're going to use a default. Nothing to do here. We could preview the configuration if we want, but we're going to go ahead and claim it. And this process takes a minute. So in the background, of course, it pushes some config to the device. At that point, you know, here now it says device claimed. We can watch what's going on, but ultimately it is going to tell this device, hey, go reach out to that wireless controller. And if you need to, download code and reboot, come back up. And once you come back up, I'm going to finish the provision and assign you to the proper floor. And at that point, it should automatically start broadcasting our Corp SID that we have built. So I'm going to pause this and just kind of wait for this to finish. So here we can see now it says it's executing its workflow. And as this workflow goes on, if we jump over to the wireless controller, we can see under monitoring AP statistics is where I went here, that this device did reach out to the controller, and it's evidently gone through a reboot here. Now as I refresh this in the background, we can see that this AP has joined the controller. It is currently downloading a newer version of code. So I'll pause yet again while it does that. Once it's done with this, it'll reboot, come back up, join. But then in the background here, we're still sitting on this executed workflow. Coming back over here, we can see it's gone. Image download, so it rebooted after it got the new image. Okay, and now that guy's back. Currently says misconfigured, but again, we're not quite done here, so it's still pushing config. All right, now we see that it says it was provisioned successfully. If we go back over here and refresh this, we should see, well, it still says misconfigured, but let's go take a look. It did not get a policy tag. nor did it get the typical, well, I think that's probably part of the default. It did get the site tag, but it did not get the policy tag. Not sure why that would be. So what we'll do here is we will jump over to provision inventory. Now we'll notice our access point is here. And let's take a look at what site tags we have here. So the policy tag, it should have received this, which should have had our corporate profile. So why it didn't, I don't know. But let's go ahead and just do another provision on the device itself. And in here, see the RF profile details. So at this point, that wireless network should be broadcasting, and I guess I don't have a wireless card on this computer. I have another machine we can use at some point, but if I look at my phone here in the background, I do see Corp as an available wireless network. So we know that's broadcasting. Now, before we move on to configuring that all up, let's go look at that phone that we've got connected here as well. So here we see on port 5 we have an IP phone. Now that phone, very much like the AP, is obviously not able to get on the network. We have no MAB policy or anything in ICE, and it's obviously not doing any authentication. If we look at the config, we can see that it is indeed got our .1x and a template. Now, all of this config on all of these ports, right? I didn't configure this. This was all pushed by DNAC, even the AP. So our closed auth, of course, that was when we chose closed auth in the fabric profile. And if we jump over to ICE, what we should see here is that this device is also failing authentications. So I'm going to guess that this is him. He doesn't have a VLAN to go to or anything, in that scenario. If I look at one of these auths, that's not it. That's a pack provisioning. Let me go probably find his MAC address. What did he say he was? 0F6E. We should see him attempting to authenticate in here. So what I did here is I went ahead and just shut that port from the phone, and we'll see if it comes back up and if we see anything here. I was only showing the latest 20 records for the last 3 hours here, and that may have been why I wasn't seeing it. So we'll see if anything shows up on the top here when it reboots. I'll jump back over the switch and watch it boot up here. So here we see we did get an auth failure for 06FE. If I come back over here to ICE, we refresh. It hit our wired MAB. And we did identify that it was a Cisco IP phone. But of course, we have no policy, so right now it's not getting put into any specific VLAN. So if we come back over to our policy sets, and our wired MAB, and in here, instead of a Cisco wireless access point, it's just Cisco-phone, Cisco IP phone. We obviously don't want to assign it to the access points VLAN because our voice VLAN is a different VLAN. That is going to be VLAN 2. So here, we'll call it phones. VLAN 2. And for voice, we're going to click this voice domain permission. Save that, except we didn't set it. And now back over to our live log. That was a couple of minutes ago, so we're going to need to wait for that guy to reboot and try to authenticate again in hopes that he will pick up the new profile. So we can see it found all the way down to the make and model of the phone based on the profile. And once we get a new authentication here, hopefully we get the right result. I'm going to go ahead and just bounce him. He's taken too long for me. We'll wait for it to come back up here. Okay, and here we saw we got our failure, so back over in ICE, we should see this guy hit the wired MAB again, so, and it got our, oh, I left it named wireless AP's copy, but it did hit the phone's authorization. At that point, we should be able to see that that port did indeed go into the voice VLAN. And we did get an IP address in 10.204.210, so that phone came online after the proper policy as well. So that brings us to the point where we could start to test our wireless SID as well. In that scenario, we still need to go back to ICE, and we need to make sure that wireless clients attempting to authenticate have something to authenticate to. So to make it easy, I am just going to create a new policy set. For the corporate SID. This is going to be wireless 802.1x. And we will go ahead and put in a new AND statement for radius called station ID ends with corp. So here we're saying if an authentication comes in with .1x and the called station ID, or in our case SID name, ends with corp, go ahead and authenticate it to that policy. In here, we are going to do more of the same. We'll say it's going to be EPMS chap v2 is the username password authentication. Obviously, I don't have any certificates or anything set up for EAP. Authenticate to our Active Directory. And in our authorization profile, we will select our Active Directory, external groups. Missed it altogether. Call it domain users, that way any user can authenticate. And here we are just going to permit access. Now we don't need to return a VLAN override here because we tied our fabric-based network to a VLAN. So all we have to do is permit this user access. He's going to get put into that corp VLAN. But we will also need a user to test with. So in here, back to Active Directory. I'll create a new user. And of course, pretty much all users are all users added to Active Directory get added to the domain users group, so we don't have to do anything there. And then over in my virtual environment here, I have this test machine. That should have a wireless network adapter on it. Here we can see our corp SID. If I hit connect, it's going to ask me for a username and password. Now here, this pop-up is because of a certificate, right? This device doesn't trust the internal cert that ICE is presenting, so that's expected. When I hit connect, we got connected. So here, if I do IP config, we can see 10.2.0.4.3, that is our SID, corporate SID network. And I'm on the internet, so our authentication there is working. If I was to go over to my wireless controller just to see here, I got logged out. We can see that we have one client connected, and sure enough, here's our user, the AP it's connected to, and everything there looks good. So that validated that our wireless is connected successfully and we're functional on Fabric Wireless. So that pretty much brings us to the end of our fabric build, right? And I hate to say it, but somewhat the tip of the iceberg, right? There's so much more to this. There's the multicast aspect of our fabric site. There's the multicast wireless, if multicast is something that's needed. One of the big pieces of DNAC as a whole is all the assurance data and making sure that that's all there, and just, a whole plethora of other things. But from a basic, we've got a fabric up and functional. Here we are. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed and hope this helped.